Isabella had always known that her 18th birthday would be different from other girls her age, but she never imagined it would mark the end of life as she knew it. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of the modest apartment she shared with her stepmother and stepsister Victoria in the heart of Chicago's South Side. Had married Isabella's father, Carlos, when Isabella was only 7 years old. Carlos was a construction foreman who had raised Isabella alone after her mother died in a car accident. Brought her own daughter Victoria, who was 3 years younger than Isabella, into their small family. For a few precious years, they had been genuinely happy together. Everything changed when Carlos died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years ago. The medical bills had drained their savings, and the small life insurance policy barely covered the funeral expenses. Who had worked part-time as a seamstress, suddenly found herself responsible for 2 teenage girls with limited resources and no family support. The financial pressure transformed from the warm, caring woman Isabella remembered into someone bitter and calculating. Victoria, sensing her mother's stress and favoritism, became increasingly demanding and entitled. Isabella found herself bearing the brunt of household responsibilities while focused all her attention and remaining resources on ensuring Victoria's future. On the morning of her 18th birthday, Isabella woke before dawn as usual to prepare breakfast and pack lunches before heading to her part-time job at laundromat downtown. The irony of working for another family with the same surname as her stepfamily wasn't lost on her. Mrs., the elderly owner, had been kind to Isabella, often letting her take home leftover food and occasionally slipping her extra money when business was good. Was already awake, sitting at their small kitchen table with a stack of official-looking papers and her laptop open. Her usually neat black hair was disheveled, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well. Victoria sat beside her mother, still in her pajamas, scrolling through her phone with a satisfied smirk. Isabella said without looking up, "Sit down, we need to talk." The serious tone made Isabella's stomach clench with anxiety. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would acknowledge her birthday with something special. Even a simple cake or small gift would have meant the world to her. Instead, the atmosphere felt heavy with unspoken tension. "I've been in contact with some people," continued, finally meeting Isabella's eyes. "People who can help our family's financial situation. There's a gentleman named Mr. Alexander Blackwood who has expressed interest in meeting you." Isabella frowned, confused by the formal way was speaking. "Meeting me? Why would a stranger want to meet me?" Victoria looked up from her phone with barely contained excitement. "He's really rich, Isabella, like seriously wealthy. He owns multiple companies and properties all over the country." "But why would he want to meet me?" Isabella repeated, a growing sense of unease settling in her chest. His hands trembled slightly as she shuffled the papers. "Mr. Blackwood is looking for a companion, someone young, responsible, and capable of managing his household affairs. The position comes with significant compensation that would solve all of our financial problems." The way avoided direct eye contact while speaking made Isabella's blood run cold. She had heard enough stories and seen enough movies to understand what kind of companion position this might involve. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "It's not what you think," said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Blackwood is a legitimate businessman. He just prefers traditional arrangements. You would live in his estate, help manage his affairs, and in return, he would provide financial support for our family." Isabella stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. "You're trying to sell me to some strange man for money." "Don't be so dramatic," Victoria interjected, rolling her eyes. "It's not like you have any other options anyway. You barely graduated high school, you work at a laundromat, and you have no prospects. At least this way, you can actually contribute something meaningful to this family." The cruelty in Victoria's words hit Isabella like a physical blow. While it was true that her grades had suffered during her father's illness, and after his death, she had still managed to graduate. She had sacrificed her own educational opportunities to work and help support the household while Victoria focused on her studies and social life. "Isabella," said, standing and moving closer to her, "I know this seems sudden, but I've been corresponding with Mr. Blackwood for weeks. He's very interested in you specifically. I showed him your photo and told him about your character, your work ethic, your loyalty to family. He's willing to pay off our debts immediately and provide a substantial monthly allowance." "How did you even get connected with this man?" Isabella demanded, backing toward the door. His face flushed with embarrassment. There's a service, an agency that connects families in difficult financial situations with wealthy individuals who are looking for household staff. It's completely legitimate. I had to fill out extensive paperwork and provide references. Isabella felt sick to her stomach. The reality of what was happening was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Her stepmother had essentially put her up for sale to the highest bidder, and that bidder happened to be someone wealthy enough to solve their financial problems. "And what about me?" Isabella asked, her voice rising with anger and desperation. "What about what I want? What about my dreams, my life, my choices?" His expression hardened. "Your choices? Isabella, let's be realistic. What choices do you have? We're 3 months behind on rent. The electricity is going to be shut off next week. Victoria has been accepted to university, but we can't afford the tuition. Your father left us with nothing but medical debt and broken dreams." "So you're sacrificing me to save Victoria's future," Isabella said, the betrayal cutting deep. "I'm giving you an opportunity to make something of yourself," replied, but even she seemed to recognize how hollow her words sounded. "Mr. Blackwood is educated, refined, and wealthy. You'll live in luxury, have access to resources you could never afford otherwise, and you'll be helping secure Victoria's education and our family's survival." Victoria looked up from her phone again, her expression coldly calculating. "Besides, Isabella, it's not like you're going to find someone better on your own. You're not exactly what guys would call attractive, and you have no money, no education, and no family connections. This might be the best offer you ever get." The final insult was too much. Isabella grabbed her worn denim jacket from the hook by the door and headed for the exit. "I need time to think about this." "There is no time," called after her. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting an answer today. He's sending a car for you at 6 o'clock tonight if you agree." Isabella stopped with her hand on the doorknob. "And if I don't agree?" The silence that followed was answer enough, and Victoria had already made their decision. Isabella was expendable in their calculations for survival and success. "The car will be a black Mercedes," said quietly. "The driver will be wearing a gray uniform and will know to look for you. Mr. Blackwood's estate is about 2 hours north of the city. You'll want to pack a bag with your essential belongings." Isabella walked out without another word, leaving behind the only family she had known since her father's death. As she walked through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she realized that everything she had believed about love, loyalty, and family had been an illusion. The day at Mrs. Laundromat passed in a blur. Isabella mechanically folded clothes and helped customers while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. Mrs. noticed her distraction and asked if she was feeling well, but Isabella couldn't bring herself to explain the situation. During her lunch break, Isabella sat in the small park across from the laundromat and tried to think through her options. She had exactly $347 in her savings account, barely enough for a security deposit on a room somewhere, let alone first month's rent and living expenses. She had no relatives she could contact, no friends with families willing to take her in, and no job prospects that would pay enough to support herself independently. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that had planned this carefully. By waiting until Isabella turned 18, she had ensured that there would be no legal complications about parental consent or responsibility. Isabella was now legally an adult with no safety net and no support system. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella found herself curious about this mysterious Mr. Alexander Blackwood. During a quiet moment at work, she used the laundromat's old computer to search for information about him online. What she found was both reassuring and disturbing. Alexander Blackwood was indeed wealthy, with business interests in real estate, technology, and international trade. His estimated net worth was in the hundreds of millions. There were photos of him at charity events and business conferences, always impeccably dressed and accompanied by beautiful women who were never identified by name. But the photos themselves were troubling. In every image, Alexander appeared to be in his 30s, despite business articles dating back over 20 years. Either he had exceptional genetics and access to the best medical care money could buy, or something else was going on. More concerning were the subtle details in the articles about his lifestyle. He was described as reclusive, someone who preferred to conduct business during evening hours, and who had unconventional living arrangements. Several pieces mentioned his extensive private estate that was rarely visited by outsiders, and his preference for traditional household management. The more Isabella read, the more questions arose in her mind. Why would an incredibly wealthy and presumably powerful man need an agency to find household staff? Why was he specifically interested in her, based only on a photo and description? And why was the compensation so generous for what was supposedly just household management? By 5 o'clock, Isabella had made her decision. She would meet with Alexander Blackwood, but she would be prepared for whatever she might encounter. She returned to the apartment to find and Victoria packing a small suitcase with her belongings. "We weren't sure you would come back," admitted, looking relieved. "I need to know exactly what I'm agreeing to," Isabella said firmly. "I want to see all the paperwork, understand all the terms, and have clear expectations about what this position involves." Handed her a thick envelope. "Everything is here. The contract is quite generous, Isabella. Mr. Blackwood has already transferred the first month's payment to our account as a show of good faith." Isabella opened the envelope and began reading through the documents. The contract was written in formal legal language that was difficult to understand, but several things stood out immediately. The position was described as personal household manager and companion, with duties including maintaining estate facilities, managing daily schedules, and providing companionship as requested. The compensation was indeed substantial, more money than Isabella had ever imagined having access to. In addition to room, board, and a generous monthly salary, there were provisions for clothing, education, and personal expenses. On the surface, it seemed almost too good to be true. But buried in the fine print were clauses that made Isabella's stomach turn. She would be required to live on the estate full-time, with limited opportunities for outside contact. Her schedule would be determined entirely by Alexander's needs and preferences. Most disturbing was a clause about absolute discretion regarding all aspects of her employer's lifestyle and business affairs. Isabella said slowly, "This contract basically makes me a prisoner. I can't leave without permission, I can't have visitors without approval, and I can't discuss anything about my life there with anyone." "Those are standard confidentiality requirements," replied, but she wouldn't meet Isabella's eyes. "Wealthy people value their privacy. It's not unusual." At exactly 6 o'clock, a black Mercedes pulled up outside their building. The driver, a middle-aged man in a gray uniform, stepped out and looked directly at their apartment window. There was something unsettling about his pale complexion and the way he moved with unusual grace and silence. Isabella grabbed her suitcase and the envelope of documents. As she headed for the door, Victoria called out, "Isabella, wait." For a moment, Isabella hoped her stepsister might express some regret or concern for her. Instead, Victoria held out her phone. "Take a selfie with me," Victoria said with a bright smile, "for memories." The request was so callous and self-centered that Isabella could only stare in disbelief. Victoria was treating this like a celebration rather than a potentially dangerous sacrifice. "Goodbye, Victoria," Isabella said quietly. "I hope university is everything you dreamed it would be." Followed Isabella to the door, and for just a moment her composure cracked. "Isabella, I hope you understand that I didn't have any other choice. Your father would have wanted me to take care of both of you girls, and this seemed like the only way to do that." Isabella looked at the woman who had been her stepmother for over a decade. "My father would have found another way. He would have worked 3 jobs, sold everything we owned, or moved us all into a studio apartment before he would have sold his daughter to a stranger." The truth of those words hung in the air between them, as Isabella walked out to meet her uncertain future. The driver opened the car door for her without speaking, and Isabella slid into the luxurious leather interior. As they pulled away from the only home she had known since childhood, Isabella watched and Victoria through the rear window. They were already heading back inside, probably to celebrate their financial windfall and Victoria's secured future. The drive north took them away from the city lights and into increasingly rural territory. The driver remained silent despite Isabella's attempts at conversation, responding only with brief nods when she asked questions about the route or estimated arrival time. As darkness fell, Isabella found herself wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The contract in her lap felt heavier with each passing mile, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was traveling toward something far more complicated and dangerous than a simple household management position. The last thing she saw before exhaustion was the driver's reflection in the mirror. In the dim light of the dashboard, his eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity, and when he smiled at her through the mirror, she could swear she glimpsed something that looked remarkably like fangs. Isabella woke to the gentle hum of the Merced's engine and the sensation of turning onto a gravel driveway. Through the tinted windows, she could make out towering iron gates that opened automatically as they approached. Ancient oak trees lined the winding path, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The estate that emerged from the darkness was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. The mansion rose 3 stories into the night sky, its Gothic architecture featuring pointed arches, ornate stonework, and tall windows that glowed with warm golden light. Perfectly manicured gardens stretched out on either side of the circular driveway, and Isabella could hear the sound of a fountain somewhere in the distance. "We have arrived, miss," the driver said, his voice carrying a slight accent that she couldn't identify. It was the first time he had spoken during the entire journey. As the car came to a stop in front of the main entrance, Isabella gathered her courage and her small suitcase. The driver appeared at her door with inhuman speed, offering his gloved hand to help her out of the vehicle. "Thank you," Isabella said, though something about his touch made her skin crawl. His hand was ice cold even through the fabric of his gloves. "I am Thomas," he said with a slight bow. "I serve as Mr. Blackwood's personal assistant and estate manager. He is waiting for you in the main library." The massive front doors opened as they approached, revealing a woman in her 50s wearing a crisp black uniform. She had silver-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Isabella's appearance. "Welcome to estate," the woman said with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I am Mrs., the head housekeeper. Mr. Blackwood has instructed me to show you to your quarters after your initial meeting." Isabella followed Thomas through an opulent foyer decorated with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and oil paintings that looked centuries old. The ceiling soared at least 20 feet above them, and a grand staircase curved elegantly toward the upper floors. Everything about the house spoke of old money and older traditions. The furniture was antique but perfectly maintained, the rugs were clearly hand-woven and priceless, and even the air seemed to carry the weight of history and secrets. "Miss," Thomas said as they paused outside massive wooden doors carved with intricate designs, "a few words of advice before you meet Mr. Blackwood. He values directness and honesty above all else. Do not attempt to deceive him or hide your thoughts. He has little patience for games or manipulation." Isabella nodded, though she wondered why Thomas felt it necessary to give her such specific guidance. "What should I expect from this meeting?" "Mr. Blackwood will want to get to know you personally before finalizing the employment arrangement," Mrs. interjected. "He believes that compatibility is essential for a successful working relationship." Thomas knocked twice on the doors before pushing them open. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Isabella has arrived." The library beyond was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked both valuable and well-read. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, and comfortable reading chairs were arranged throughout the space. The room smelled of old books, expensive wood polish, and something else Isabella couldn't identify, something that made her pulse quicken with an inexplicable mix of fear and attraction. At first, Isabella didn't see anyone in the room. Then a figure moved away from one of the tall windows, and she found herself face to face with Alexander Blackwood. He was nothing like what she had expected based on the online photos. Those images had shown a conventionally handsome businessman in expensive suits, someone who could easily blend into any corporate boardroom. The man standing before her was something else entirely. Alexander Blackwood was tall, probably 6 feet 3 inches, with a lean but powerful build that was evident even beneath his perfectly tailored dark suit. His hair was black as midnight and slightly longer than current fashion dictated, giving him an almost romantic appearance. But it was his face that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. He was devastatingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost inhuman. His features were sharp and aristocratic, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and full lips that curved in a slight smile as he watched her reaction. But his eyes were what truly captivated her. They were a deep amber color that seemed to glow in the firelight, and when he looked at her, Isabella felt as though he could see directly into her soul. "Miss," he said, his voice a rich baritone with traces of an accent she couldn't place. Please, come in. Thomas, missus, that will be all for now. As the doors closed behind her, Isabella found herself alone with perhaps the most compelling and dangerous man she had ever encountered. Everything about him radiated power and control, but there was something else, an undercurrent of barely contained intensity that made her instinctively step backward. Please sit, Alexander said, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. Would you care for something to drink, wine perhaps, or something stronger? I don't drink alcohol, Isabella replied, settling carefully into the indicated chair. And I'm only 18 as of today, so it wouldn't be legal anyway. Alexander's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed unusually white and sharp. Ah yes, your birthday. Happy birthday, Isabella. I hope you don't mind if I use your given name. I find formal titles unnecessarily distant in personal relationships. Thank you, Isabella said, though something about the way he said her name made her shiver. And I should clarify something right away, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not sure exactly what my stepmother told your agency, but I want to be clear about what I'm willing and not willing to do. Direct and honest, just as Thomas suggested, Alexander said approvingly. He moved to pour himself a glass of what looked like red wine from a crystal decanter. Please, tell me what concerns you have about the position. Isabella took a deep breath and tried to organize her thoughts. The contract mentions being your companion and providing companionship as requested. I need to know if that's a euphemism for something I'm not comfortable with. Alexander paused in his wine pouring, and Isabella could swear she saw his hand tighten on the crystal decanter. When he turned back to face her, his expression was unreadable. Isabella, he said carefully, I can assure you that I have no intention of forcing you into any situation that would compromise your virtue or dignity. However, I must be equally direct with you about my expectations and circumstances. He settled into the chair across from her, and Isabella noticed that he moved with an unusual grace, almost as though he were floating rather than walking. Up close, she could see that his skin was remarkably pale and seemed to have an almost luminescent quality in the firelight. I am not like other men you may have encountered, Alexander continued. My lifestyle, my needs, my very nature are unconventional. The companion I require must be someone who can adapt to unusual circumstances and maintain absolute discretion about what they observe in my home. What kind of unusual circumstances? Isabella asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Alexander studied her for a long moment, and Isabella felt as though he were weighing how much truth she could handle. I suffer from a rare medical condition that requires me to maintain very specific living conditions. I cannot tolerate sunlight, which is why all of my business is conducted during evening hours. My diet is extremely restricted, and I often require assistance managing the symptoms of my condition. That explanation seemed plausible enough, though it didn't address the more concerning aspects of the contract. Mr. Blackwood, why did you choose me specifically? You're obviously wealthy enough to hire professional staff with experience and credentials. I'm 18 years old with no training in household management or personal care. An astute question, Alexander said, taking a sip of his wine. I have found that experienced staff often come with preconceived notions about how things should be done. They are set in their ways and resistant to adapting to my particular requirements. You, on the other hand, would learn my preferences from the beginning and would not need to unlearn habits that don't serve my needs. Isabella sensed there was more to his reasoning than he was revealing, but she decided to address her most immediate concern. The contract states that I would live here full-time with limited outside contact. That sounds less like employment and more like imprisonment. Alexander's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment, Isabella saw something predatory flash in his amber eyes. Isabella, I value my privacy above almost everything else. The work I do, the way I live, the challenges I face with my medical condition, all of these require absolute confidentiality. I cannot risk having someone in my household who might share information with outsiders, intentionally or otherwise. But surely I would be allowed to visit my family occasionally, or have friends call or write. Your family, Alexander said, and there was unmistakable contempt in his voice. You mean the stepmother who sold you to pay for her biological daughter's education? The same woman who was willing to send you into an unknown situation with a complete stranger for financial gain. The harsh truth of his words hit Isabella like a physical blow. He was absolutely right, of course, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her realize how completely alone she was in the world. "I have no illusions about my situation," Isabella said quietly. "But that doesn't change my need to maintain some connection to the outside world. What you're describing sounds like isolation, not employment." Alexander set down his wine glass and leaned forward in his chair, fixing her with an intense stare. "Isabella, I'm offering you luxury beyond anything you have ever experienced. You will have your own suite of rooms, access to my extensive library, gourmet meals prepared by a professional chef, a wardrobe of fine clothing, and educational opportunities that could prepare you for any future you might choose." "In exchange for giving up my freedom," Isabella replied. "In exchange for giving up the illusion of freedom you never actually possessed," Alexander corrected. "Tell me, what freedom did you have living with your stepmother? The freedom to work at a laundromat for minimum wage? The freedom to watch your stepsister receive all the advantages while you were treated as unpaid domestic help? The freedom to struggle with poverty and uncertainty for the rest of your life?" His words stung because they contained an uncomfortable amount of truth. Isabella had to acknowledge that her options in the outside world were severely limited, and the compensation Alexander was offering would provide security she had never known. "What exactly would my duties involve?" she asked, trying to focus on practical matters. "You would manage my schedule, correspondence, and household affairs during my waking hours, which are primarily evening and nighttime. You would accompany me to business meetings and social events when required. You would assist me with my medical needs when symptoms arise. And yes, you would provide companionship, conversation, shared meals, perhaps games of chess or reading aloud in the evenings." That didn't sound entirely unreasonable, though Isabella still sensed he was holding back important information. "And Mrs. Thomas, what are their roles?" "Mrs. manages the day-to-day operations of the house, cleaning, meal preparation, maintenance schedules. Thomas handles my business affairs, travel arrangements, and serves as liaison with the outside world when necessary. You would be working with them, not replacing them." Alexander stood and moved to the fireplace, gazing into the flames. "Isabella, I want you to understand something. I'm offering you this position not just because I need the assistance, but because I believe you have qualities that would make you an excellent companion. Your stepmother's description of your character, your loyalty, your work ethic, your resilience in the face of adversity, these are traits I value highly." "But you don't actually know me," Isabella pointed out. "You're basing this decision on limited information from someone who was motivated to present me in the most favorable light possible." Alexander turned back to her with that unsettling smile. "I am an excellent judge of character, Isabella. I can see honesty in your eyes, strength in the way you carry yourself despite your circumstances, and intelligence in the questions you ask. I believe we could have a very successful arrangement." Isabella felt herself being drawn in by his compelling presence and persuasive words, but something deep in her subconscious was screaming warnings. Everything about this situation felt too convenient, too perfect, too good to be true. "I need time to think about this," she said, standing up from her chair. "This is a major life decision, and I don't want to make it impulsively." Alexander nodded, though she caught a flash of impatience in his expression. "Of course, Mrs. will show you to the guest quarters where you can spend the night. However, I do need your decision by tomorrow evening. I have urgent matters that require attention, and I cannot afford to delay filling this position indefinitely." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. appeared at the library doors. Isabella wondered how the woman had known the conversation was ending, unless she had been listening outside. "Mrs. will provide you with nightwear and toiletries," Alexander said. "I hope you sleep well and that morning brings you clarity about your decision." Isabella followed Mrs. up the grand staircase and through a maze of corridors lined with more oil paintings and antique furniture. The house seemed even larger from the inside than it had appeared from outside, and Isabella wondered how many people it would take to properly maintain such a massive estate. "Here we are," Mrs. said, opening a door to reveal a bedroom that was larger than the entire apartment Isabella had shared with her stepfamily. The four-poster bed was draped in rich burgundy fabrics, and French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the gardens. "This is beautiful," Isabella said honestly. "Thank you." Mrs. placed a neatly folded nightgown and robe on the bed, along with a basket of luxury toiletries. "The bathroom is through that door, and there are fresh towels in the linen closet. If you need anything during the night, there's a bell pull by the bed that will summon assistance." As Mrs. moved toward the door, Isabella impulsively called out, "Can I ask you something?" The older woman paused with her hand on the doorknob. "Of course, dear. How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" Mrs. expression became carefully neutral. "I have been in his employ for 15 years. And Thomas? Thomas has served Mr. Blackwood for much longer than I have. He is extremely devoted to his position." Isabella sensed there was more to the story, but Mrs.'s body language made it clear she wasn't going to elaborate. Is Mr. Blackwood a good employer?" For the first time, Mrs.'s professional mask slipped slightly, and Isabella glimpsed something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. "Mr. Blackwood is a complex man with complex needs, Isabella. He rewards loyalty and competence, but he does not tolerate deception or betrayal. My advice to you is to be completely honest with him at all times, even if you think the truth might displease him." After Mrs. left, Isabella found herself alone in the luxurious guest room, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Less than a day ago, she had been living in a cramped apartment, working at a laundromat, and worrying about making ends meet. Now she was being offered a life of luxury in exchange for what still felt like an enormous sacrifice of personal freedom. She walked out onto the balcony and looked out over the moonlit gardens. The estate grounds stretched farther than she could see in the darkness, and the isolation of her situation became even more apparent. If she accepted Alexander's offer, she would be completely dependent on him for everything: housing, food, clothing, contact with the outside world. But what were her alternatives? She could return to Chicago, but she had no home to return to. And Victoria had made it clear that their financial survival depended on Isabella accepting this arrangement. She could try to find another job and a place to live, but with her limited education and experience, she would likely end up in an even worse situation than before. As she stood on the balcony, Isabella noticed something strange about the grounds below. Despite the late hour, she could see several figures moving through the gardens. They walked with the same unusual grace she had observed in Thomas, and even from a distance, something about their movement patterns seemed inhuman. She was about to go back inside when she heard a soft tapping at her bedroom door. Isabella assumed it was Mrs. checking on her, but when she opened the door, she found Alexander standing in the hallway. He had changed from his business suit into more casual clothing, dark slacks, and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Without the formal attire, he looked younger but somehow more dangerous. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, though he made no move to leave. "I wanted to address something I should have mentioned during our conversation." "What's that?" Isabella asked, acutely aware that she was wearing only the nightgown Mrs. had provided. "The position I'm offering comes with certain risks," Alexander said seriously. "My medical condition, the isolation of the estate, the nature of my business dealings, all of these factors create situations that could potentially be dangerous for someone unprepared to handle them." Isabella felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of dangers?" Alexander stepped closer, and Isabella caught that strange scent again, something wild and intoxicating that made her feel slightly dizzy. "I have enemies, Isabella, people who would use anyone close to me to gain advantage or cause harm. Anyone in my household must be prepared to face the possibility of threats or attempts at coercion." "Are you saying my life would be in danger?" "I'm saying that I would never allow harm to come to you," Alexander replied, his amber eyes glowing with intensity. "But I cannot guarantee that others wouldn't attempt to use you against me. This is one reason why discretion and loyalty are so crucial in this position." Isabella stared at him, trying to process this new information. "Mr. Blackwood, are you involved in illegal activities?" Alexander's laugh was soft but held no warmth. "My business dealings are entirely legal, though not always conventional. However, in my line of work, success often creates resentment and competition. Not everyone plays by genteel rules." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, and Isabella was startled by how cold his skin felt. "You are very brave to even consider this arrangement, Isabella. Most people your age would be terrified by the uncertainties involved." "Maybe I should be terrified," Isabella said quietly, though she made no move to pull away from his touch. "Perhaps," Alexander agreed. "But I sense that you are tired of being afraid of the future, tired of having no control over your circumstances, tired of being at the mercy of others who see you as expendable. His words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Isabella was tired of all those things, and the prospect of finally having security and purpose was incredibly tempting. "I need to ask you something directly," Isabella said, gathering her courage. "Are you human?" Alexander's hand stilled against her cheek, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked to reveal something wild and predatory. Then he smiled, and Isabella saw the sharp canine teeth she had glimpsed earlier. "That is a very perceptive question," he said softly. "What do you think?" Before Isabella could answer, Alexander stepped back and bowed formally. "Sleep well, Isabella. Tomorrow evening you will give me your decision, and we will both learn what fate has planned for us." As he disappeared back into the shadows of the corridor, Isabella realized that she had just received the answer to her question, even though he hadn't spoken it aloud. Whatever Alexander Blackwood was, he was definitely not entirely human. And somehow, that revelation didn't frighten her as much as it probably should have. Isabella barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's amber gaze and those sharp teeth that had confirmed her growing suspicions about his true nature. By the time pale morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, she had made her decision, though she wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. She spent the day exploring the mansion with Mrs. as her guide, learning more about what her life would be like if she accepted the position. The house was even more impressive in daylight, with room after room of priceless antiques, rare books, and artwork that belonged in museums. "Mr. Blackwood is a collector," Mrs. explained as they toured a gallery filled with paintings from various historical periods. "He has particular interests in medieval history, Renaissance art, and artifacts from ancient civilizations." Isabella paused in front of a painting that depicted a medieval feast, complete with nobles in elaborate clothing and servants attending to their needs. "How long has he been collecting?" Mrs. expression became evasive. "Mr. Blackwood has had many years to develop his interests and acquire pieces that speak to him." As they continued through the house, Isabella noticed several things that reinforced her suspicions about Alexander's inhuman nature. There were no mirrors anywhere in the mansion. All the windows had heavy curtains or shutters that blocked out sunlight completely, and she had yet to see any of the staff during daylight hours except for Mrs. Isabella said as they paused in what appeared to be a formal dining room, "Can I ask you something personal?" The older woman nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "When you first came to work here, were you afraid?" Mrs. was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella could see her weighing how much truth to reveal. "Yes," she said finally. "I was terrified, but I was also desperate. My husband had just died, leaving me with enormous medical debts and no means of support. Mr. Blackwood offered me employment when no one else would even consider hearing a woman my age. And now, after 15 years, a genuine smile crossed Mrs. face. "Now I understand that Mr. Blackwood's loyalty runs as deep as his expectations. He has provided for me beyond anything I could have imagined, and in return, I have given him my complete devotion. It is not a conventional arrangement, but it has been mutually beneficial." That afternoon, Isabella found herself in the estate's extensive library, reading about local history and trying to learn more about the area. What she discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. A estate had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Blackwood. According to the historical records, the property had remained in the Blackwood family for generations, though there were curious gaps in the family tree and several unexplained disappearances of family members over the years. More interesting were the local legends about the estate. There were stories of strange occurrences in the surrounding forest, reports of unusual wildlife behavior, and folklore about creatures that hunted in the darkness. While Isabella normally would have dismissed such tales as rural superstition, her encounter with Alexander had made her more open to possibilities she would have previously considered impossible. As evening approached, Isabella prepared for what she knew would be a pivotal conversation. She chose her words carefully, knowing that her decision would affect not just her own future, but potentially her very survival. Alexander was waiting for her in the library again, this time seated behind a massive mahogany desk with several leather-bound ledgers open before him. He looked up as she entered, and Isabella was struck again by his otherworldly beauty and the predatory grace in his movements. "Isabella," he said, rising from his chair. "I trust you slept well and have had time to consider our discussion." "I have," Isabella replied, moving to stand in front of his desk. "And I have questions that I need answered before I can give you my decision." Alexander nodded approvingly. "I would be disappointed if you didn't. Please ask whatever you need to know." Isabella took a deep breath and decided to be direct. "Are you a vampire?" Alexander's smile was both amused and admiring. "You continue to impress me with your perceptiveness." "Yes, Isabella, I am what mortals call a vampire. I require blood to survive, I cannot tolerate sunlight, and I possess abilities that far exceed normal human limitations." The casual way he confirmed her suspicions should have sent her running, but instead, Isabella found herself strangely relieved to finally have the truth. "How old are you?" "I was transformed in 1847, when I was 31 years old. That makes me chronologically 179 years old, though I maintain the physical appearance and capabilities of my human age at transformation." Isabella did quick mental math. The estate records show Blackwood built this house in the 1890s. "Was my younger brother," Alexander explained. "I had been a vampire for several decades by the time he built. When he died, I inherited the property and have maintained the fiction of being subsequent generations of the Blackwood family." "And Thomas, Mrs. are they?" "Thomas is like me, though he was transformed much earlier, sometime in the 15th century. Mrs. is human, as are most of the staff. I prefer to maintain a balance between my own kind and mortals in my household." Isabella processed this information, trying to reconcile her growing attraction to Alexander with the reality of what he was. "Why do you need a human companion? Surely Thomas could handle your business affairs and household management." Alexander moved from behind his desk to stand closer to her, and Isabella caught that intoxicating scent that seemed to emanate from his skin. "Thomas is invaluable for many things, but he cannot provide what I truly need: connection to humanity, companionship that bridges the gap between my immortal nature and the mortal world I must navigate." "And the previous companions?" Isabella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Alexander's expression darkened. "There have been others over the years, though not many. Some found the isolation unbearable and asked to leave. Others could not adapt to the unique demands of my lifestyle. A few." He paused, and Isabella saw genuine regret in his eyes. "A few made choices that forced me to terminate our arrangement permanently." The euphemistic way he phrased that last part made Isabella's blood run cold. "You killed them." "I protected myself and my household from betrayal," Alexander corrected, though he didn't deny her interpretation. "Isabella, I want you to understand something crucial. The vampire world is not the romanticized fantasy depicted in literature and films. We are predators by nature, and we live by rules that govern survival in a hostile environment. Loyalty and discretion are not just preferences, they are matters of life and death." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to continue asking the questions that could determine her fate. "If I accept this position, would you? Would you turn me into a vampire?" Alexander's answer came without hesitation. "Not unless you explicitly requested it, and even then, only after you had been with me long enough to fully understand what such a transformation would mean. Vampirism is not a gift to be given lightly." "But you would feed from me?" "With your consent, yes. I require fresh blood to maintain my strength, and having a willing donor is far preferable to hunting. However, I would never take more than you could safely give, and I would ensure that you received proper nutrition and medical care to maintain your health." The clinical way he discussed using her as a food source should have horrified Isabella, but instead, she found herself curious about the experience. "Does it hurt?" Alexander's smile became almost tender. "Quite the opposite. The bite of a vampire produces intense pleasure in the donor. It is one of the ways we ensure cooperation and discourage resistance." Isabella felt her cheeks flush with heat at the implications of his words. Despite everything she had learned, she was still powerfully attracted to Alexander, and the thought of that kind of intimate connection with him was both terrifying and thrilling. "What would happen if I decided to leave after accepting the position?" she asked. Alexander's expression became serious again. "If you chose to leave for legitimate reasons, homesickness, inability to adapt, genuine unhappiness, I would arrange for your departure with a substantial financial settlement, and take measures to ensure your silence about what you had learned here. And if I tried to betray you or expose your secret? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Isabella saw the predator that lived beneath Alexander's civilized exterior. Then you would discover why my kind has survived for while keeping our existence hidden from the mortal world. The threat was clear, but Isabella appreciated his honesty more than false reassurances. Mr. Blackwood, Alexander, I need you to understand my situation. I have nothing and no one in the outside world. My stepmother has made it clear that I'm not welcome to return home. I have no other family, no significant savings, and limited job prospects. In many ways, accepting your offer feels like my only real option. I am aware of your circumstances, Alexander said gently. And while I regret that desperation has brought you to my door, I cannot deny that it serves my purposes. You are intelligent, brave, and adaptable, qualities I need in a companion. But more than that, you are uncorrupted by the cynicism and jadedness that comes with age and experience. You still possess the capacity for wonder, for growth, for genuine connection. Isabella looked around the opulent library, thinking about the luxury she would gain and the freedom she would lose. If I accept, what would my life actually be like? Day to day, I mean. Alexander seemed pleased by the practical nature of her question. You would wake in the late afternoon and begin your day by reviewing my schedule and correspondence. We would share an evening meal. I can consume regular food, though it provides no nutritional value for me. You would accompany me to business meetings when appropriate, help me manage household affairs, and assist with my research and investment activities. And the companionship aspects. We would spend time together in whatever ways brought us both enjoyment. Conversation, games, reading, perhaps exploring my various collections and interests. I am hoping to find someone who can provide intellectual stimulation as well as practical assistance. Isabella took a deep breath and made her decision. I accept your offer, Alexander, with conditions. Alexander raised an eyebrow. You are negotiating with a vampire, Isabella. That takes considerable courage. What conditions? First, I want regular communication with the outside world, even if it's limited. I want to be able to write letters, make occasional phone calls, and perhaps receive visits from approved guests. Alexander considered this. I can agree to supervised correspondence and phone calls. Visits would need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Second, I want your word that you will never transform me into a vampire without my explicit, freely given consent. You have it. And third, I want to understand exactly what my duties will involve regarding feeding. Alexander moved even closer, and Isabella found herself looking up into his mesmerizing amber eyes. I would require feeding approximately once every 2 weeks. The process is intimate but not sexual, unless you desired it to be. I would take perhaps a pint of blood, which is well within safe limits for a healthy donor. Isabella's heart was racing, though whether from fear or anticipation she couldn't say. When would this start? Tonight, if you are willing. I have not fed properly in several days, and conducting business negotiations while managing hunger makes me unpredictable. The thought of Alexander being unpredictable was terrifying, but Isabella found herself nodding. Okay, but I want Mrs. Present at least for the first time. Alexander looked amused by her caution. If it would make you feel safer, though I assure you it is unnecessary, Mrs. has assisted with such matters before. As if on cue, Mrs. appeared at the library doors. Isabella was beginning to wonder if the woman had supernatural hearing, or if Alexander had some way of summoning her telepathically. Mrs., Alexander said, please prepare the blue sitting room for Isabella's first feeding. Use the ceremonial goblet and have the medical supplies ready as a precaution. Of course, sir, Mrs. replied with a respectful curtsy. Miss, perhaps you would like to freshen up first. I've taken the liberty of laying out some appropriate clothing in your room. An hour later, Isabella found herself in an elegantly appointed sitting room wearing a flowing white dress that Mrs. had selected. The gown was beautiful but also practical, with sleeves that could be easily pushed up and fabric that wouldn't show stains. Alexander entered the room carrying an ornate silver goblet that looked ancient and valuable. He had changed into a simple black shirt and dark trousers, and his hair was pulled back from his face. Are you ready? He asked gently. Isabella nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. Alexander guided her to a comfortable chaise lounge and sat beside her. "Give me your arm," he said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that seemed to resonate through Isabella's entire body. As she extended her left arm, Alexander pushed up the flowing sleeve and examined her wrist and forearm. His touch was cool but gentle, and Isabella felt an unexpected warmth spreading through her body. "Try to relax," Alexander murmured, positioning the goblet beneath her arm. "The anticipation is far worse than the reality." Isabella felt the sharp prick of his fangs piercing the delicate skin of her wrist, followed immediately by the most intense pleasure she had ever experienced. It was as though liquid fire was flowing through her veins, carrying waves of blissful sensation to every part of her body. She was vaguely aware of Alexander drinking from her, of the warm blood flowing into the ornate goblet, but mostly she was lost in the overwhelming euphoria of the feeding. She understood now why he had said donors didn't resist. The experience was addictively pleasurable. When Alexander finally lifted his head and carefully sealed the small wounds with his tongue, Isabella felt dazed and slightly weakened, but also strangely fulfilled. She had just participated in something ancient and primal, something that connected her to Alexander in a way she had never experienced with another person. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked, his amber eyes studying her face carefully. "Wonderful," Isabella admitted, though she was embarrassed by the breathless quality of her voice. "Is it always like that?" Alexander's smile was both proud and possessive. "It will be even better as we become more attuned to each other. The vampire-donor bond deepens over time, creating a connection that transcends the purely physical." Mrs. appeared with a silver tray containing orange juice, crackers, and what appeared to be iron supplements. "For your recovery, dear," she said kindly. "It's important to maintain your strength and health." As Isabella slowly sipped the orange juice and felt her strength returning, she realized that she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer fully human in any meaningful sense. She was now part of Alexander's world, with all the dangers and dark wonders that entailed. "Welcome to your new life, Isabella," Alexander said, raising the goblet in a toast. "I believe we are going to have a very interesting partnership." Looking into his ancient, compelling eyes, Isabella knew that he was absolutely right. Whatever lay ahead, her life would never be boring again. She had traded the safety and limitations of mortality for luxury, danger, and a connection to something far older and more powerful than she had ever imagined. As Alexander drank the remaining blood from the ceremonial goblet, Isabella realized that she felt no revulsion or horror at the sight. Instead, she felt pride at being chosen, satisfaction at being needed, and anticipation for whatever dark adventures awaited her in the halls of a state. The 18-year-old girl who had left Chicago the night before was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more daring, and infinitely more alive than she had ever been before. Isabella had found her destiny in the arms of a monster, and she had never been happier. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Chicago, Victoria was celebrating her acceptance to university, never knowing that her stepsister's sacrifice had just begun an adventure that would span decades and transform both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The Vampire King had found his companion, and Isabella had found her home. In the darkness of a state, under the protection and possession of Alexander Blackwood, she would learn that sometimes the monsters in the shadows offer more truth and loyalty than the humans who walk in the light.